Welcome to examining writings about Australians' experiences of World War One and World War Two. Just by way of introduction, on the left here we see a copy of A Fortunate Life, an autobiography by A.B. Facey. Apparently, when he was in his 80s, he had taken this book into the Fremantle Arts Centre to request 20 copies to be printed and bound for family members. It was immediately accepted for publication and appeared just 9 months before his death in 1982, in his 88th year. It sold 1 million copies, and a large part of that biography was about his experiences as a young man in Western Australia and the hardships he suffered in rural Western Australia, but also the joys of living in the country, and then his experiences at Gallipoli in 1915. On the right is The Ridge and the River, which is a book about Bougainville and experience of World War II. So moving right along, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. So in this course, we'll examine poetry and novels from World War One, World War Two, and we will talk a bit about some of the influences on that writing and hopefully uncover some books that you may not be aware of, or some other writings that you may not be aware of or would like to revisit. So the Gallipoli we'll begin with in the First World War, in the first section, first hour, and we'll be looking at some books such as that written by signaller Ellis Silas, called Diary of an Anzac, A Fortunate Life, which I just mentioned, and we'll talk a bit about poetry as well. In the second hour, we're going to be looking at World War II. We'll look at the Christmas books, which were very popular in World War II, which were compilations from soldiers in active service, writings, non-fiction, short story, poetry, artworks, cartoons, and so on. We'll talk a bit about Come Spinner, and we'll also talk about some books called The book called The Ridge and the River, and a few more, and been at war with Germany, and Australians as part of the empire were keen initially to join up and recruit, as we can see from this poster, to send soldiers to Europe to support the home of what they saw often as the motherland or the homeland of Britain. So that was definitely a part of the early experience of war, this enthusiasm that we'd probably find surprising today with 2 world wars behind us. 1,000 Australians served in the Australians' first major campaign in the Dardanelles at Gallipoli. There were approximately 8,700 deaths and 18,000 wounded. So it was a very high casualty rate. And then, of course, there was also the Western Front. Over almost 300,000 soldiers served and played an important part, particularly in 1918, in breaking the Hindenburg Line and forcing Germany to basically move to armistice and so on and so forth. The casualties of Australians serving was huge, with 46,000 and over 130,000 wounded on the Western Front. At the disastrous Battle of Fromelles on July 1920, almost 2,000 Australians were killed or died from wounds as a result of that 2-day campaign. We'll talk a bit about post-World War One and the return of the soldiers. So let's start off with Gallipoli Diary and Sketches by signaller Ellis Silas. I get the name mixed up. Born in London, Lewis Silas trained as an artist, and he studied art from his father and was also a student of the artist Walter Sickert. In 1907, aged 23, Silas moved to Australia, where he continued to develop as a painter. In October 1914, he enlisted as a private in the 16th Battalion of the Australian Imperial Forces. The battalion trained in Egypt and then landed at Gallipoli in April. So Silas served as a signalman at Pope's Hill, Queen's Post and Bloody Angle, and he kept a diary and sketchbook, but after 6 weeks he was suffering from neurasthenia and enteric fever, and he was evacuated from Turkey back to Egypt before being discharged as medically unfit in London in August 1916. His sketches were very popular and were viewed by King George and Queen Mary, and he wrote a number of books, and the Diary of the Anzac was his diary with his illustrations. So he continued to live in England after the war, actually, and have a career there as an artist and writer. So here we have some examples of his writing. I'll just read this out. And first of all, he begins with the experience of travelling to Egypt from Australia. It was a sight, this huge fleet of transports, ploughing its way through a sapphire sea, a spectacle that perhaps will never be seen again. That this vast fleet was able to sail all those thousands of miles without an escort of any kind is an excellent proof of the splendid work the Navy has done. And then he moves on to talk, he's at Gallipoli on the right-hand page here, and he writes about the sketch he's made and about, I don't know if this was Bloody Angle. He wrote, "It was across this exposed spot that many times I had to run dispatches. The ridge on the right where shrapnel can be seen bursting was thick with snipers who had this patch so well set that they rarely missed their mark. The poor chaps seen in this drawing all got caught when trying to get across. I wondered if I would join them." Here are some other pages I'll leave for you to read. The one on the left is about swimming at Anzac Cove, and it talks about what happened there. And then the other one on the right talks about the drawing of these men in the trenches and the sight of a dead body that they're not able to move. One of their mates, one of their colleagues who's died. So I'll just let you read that for a minute, and then I'll move on. Okay, so the Anzac Book was an anthology that was published around the time of in 1916, and it was a precursor to the ones that were published in World War II. It was a collection of illustrations, poems, stories, and other creative works from the soldiers on the Gallipoli Peninsula, and it was organised by Charles Bean, the well-known official war correspondent and later historian. It was immensely successful. There's just a copy of some poems written in that book, and I think you could probably find it somewhere as a PDF if you looked hard enough on the internet. The humour was, as always, a part of the sort of presentation of the Anzac spirit, and this miscellaneous public notices page, if you look at it, has some interesting and sometimes funny advertisements relating to Gallipoli. So we talked a little bit about A Fortunate Life before, so I won't spend too much talking about the background. A.B. Facey was born in 1894, and he lived through a rough frontier life as a labourer and farmer before he went off to war. So he then went back to Western Australia, and he married this young woman who used to send him, or had sent him, a Red Cross package, I think. I think it's in the video that we watch afterwards. So it's a remarkable story in terms of how his book was released in the 1980s and became an instant hit. And here's just another section from the book that talks about his experiences at Gallipoli. On the left, writes about the landing, and on the right talks about some more about the landing as well. There's no question that he was at Gallipoli. All the records show he was, but some people have queried whether he was actually at the landing, but he was writing from experience. Good enough for me. It was, as I said, it was a sensation in Australian public. A number of novels written after the war by Australians. Flesh in Armour by Leonard Mann has been called Australia's best known and finest novel about the Great War. Pretty much forgotten today.
While men were under a constant hail of shells and participating in pointless waves of assaults and massacres on both sides, ordered by generals who lacked any imagination or humanity. The only comforts they received were occasional rations of butter and bread to replace the almost inedible tinned beef and tooth-breaking biscuits, or the occasional comfort packages sent by people back home, which were randomly distributed among the troops. The only such package Bert was ever to receive was a pair of hand-knitted socks and a message of good luck from a Girl Guides leader called Evelyn Gibson, who lived in a small town in his home state. Bert determined that if he survived, he would visit her and thank her personally for the gift. Both of his older brothers were soon killed in the fighting.
The Middle Parts of Fortune, Somme and Acne, was written by Frederick Manning, who was Australian born but served in the British Army. So these were two well-known novels of the time. So Leonard Mann enlisted in the AIF. He served as a sapper and was promoted to sergeant in March 1917. No, it must have been later. Sorry. Anyway, and so his book was quite successful, Flesh in Armour, and won Australian Literature Society's Gold Medal. The story centres on three mismatched enlistees who joined the AIF in 1917, tracing their journey through combat, camaraderie and personal disintegration. One protagonist dies heroically in battle, another succumbs to mental collapse and an ignoble end, while the survivor endures, collectively symbolising the diverse fates of the 420,000 Australians who served. It also critiques the incompetence of British commanders, which was seen as a theme, for example, in the movie of Gallipoli. And it talks about, it builds on, I suppose you would have to say, on the Anzac legend. The Middle Parts of Fortune, which I mentioned, was written by Frederick Manning, who was born in Sydney but moved to England. And this was a well-known book that was praised by many, including Ernest Hemingway. So it's interesting to look. If we talk about books, there was none of the sort of the anti-war movement that we saw so strongly with English poets such as Rupert Brooke, Sigfrid Sassoon, Robert Graves, and of course the German book All Quiet on the Western Front. And we were talking about this in the course, and a few people said that, look, it may have had something to do with the poetry, that, you know, we were really into our bush poetry, and the idea of writing such a personal poetry didn't always spring to mind as being something to do. Yeah, it's an interesting discussion. There were some anti-war poems, such as from Mary Gilmore back in Australia, who had initially been very patriotic about the war, but by the end of the war wrote about the suffering of not only the soldiers, but their families, the mothers and the wives and the children and friends and relatives back home, you know, seeing this endless list of casualties and just the terrible impact on society. Yeah, so this is just an abstract talking about the role of nationalism in Australian war literature of 1930s. For those of you who are interested, you can look on the State Library of New South Wales website, and if you join up, you get access to a number of these online journals for free. Just a typical Digger cartoon, I thought I'd add it in there at the end. Mud, slush, misery everywhere. Digger writing letter on a bully beef box. How do you spell delightful, Bill? So World War II, beginnings and Australian involvement, Europe and the Middle East. We know about the beginnings of World War II with Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany invading Poland, England honouring their guarantee to support Poland, although in practice they actually didn't do much. But it's what kicked off the war, and France as well, of course. Australia, as part of the British Empire, also declared war on Germany. There wasn't the same further as there was in 1914 by any means, but the Australian government raised 3 army divisions to be sent to support Britain, most of whom fought against Germany in the Middle East, including at Tobruk, but also in Greece and Crete. 416,000, oh no, that's from the First World War, sorry. And then, of course, the war with Japan was a major issue for Australia in terms of a new threat, and the idea that Australia would be directly threatened, as it was for a little while. 1 million Australians served in World War II between 1939 and 1945. Approximately 1 million served, with over 500,000 serving overseas in Europe, the Mediterranean and the Pacific. More than 39,000 Australians lost their lives and 30,000 became prisoners of war. And then, of course, there was a major move to recruit, and in particular, the whole issue of the workforce was a lot more prominent, and saw opportunities for women to join the land army, to work on the land as ACAC gunners or anti-aircraft gunners. So there were a range of service branches: Navy, Army, Air Force and the Merchant Navy. And as I mentioned before, Australia came under a direct attack from the Japanese, with bombings occurring at Darwin and Broome, and of course the 1942 Sydney Harbour midget submarine raid. There were campaigns against Japanese forces in the Pacific War, fighting against Japan to defend home territory and support Allied strategy. And key campaigns included Malaya, Singapore, the Kokoda Track Campaign in Papua New Guinea, Battle of Milne Bay, and other major offensives in New Guinea, Bougainville and Borneo. There were many Australians who served overseas as in the Empire Air Training Scheme. Approximately 15,500 members of the RAAF were serving in Britain and Western Europe at the time of the German surrender, so huge numbers. 12,300 were qualified aircrew pilots. And this will be of some significance when we talk about the novels later on. In particular, probably not well known, that Paul Brickhill, not well known today, Paul Brickhill was a Sydney sider. He went to the same school in North Sydney as me, but a bit before. He enlisted and was sent over as a fighter pilot. He was shot down on the 17th of March 1943 over Tunisia, and he became a prisoner of war. And he was involved, sorry, I'm just going to flick back again. Oh, what have I done? Can't go back. Okay, he was involved with the Great Escape, and basically he brought the whole event to prominence. The book that he wrote, The Great Escape, covers the planning, execution and aftermath of what became the Great Escape. In March 1944, 76 men escaped from a prisoner of war camp in Germany. 73 were recaptured, and 50 of those were shot by the Gestapo's notorious secret police in violation of the Geneva Convention. And so Paul Brickhill really felt that he should write about this and bring it to prominence, which he definitely did.
Ready to take the rap for every man in the camp. Danny, the Tunnel King. He dug 16 escape tunnels in 16 different prisons, and the Germans still have him. Sedgwick, the manufacturer. He can make anything out of anything else, and make it work. These were the reckless, defiant men. These men plotted. These men dared. These men lived. The Great Escape. The great drama, the great entertainment, the great adventure begins with The Great Escape.
So my brother Jack will talk about. This was written by George Johnston, who's very well known as a sort of a bohemian writer and journalist. And it really circulates, although it's not about the war, it's primarily about these two brothers' relationship, and David's brother Jack, who he sees as very fearless. But the irony is that in the end, Jack is not able to go to war in World War II, whereas David becomes a journalist and ends up as a correspondent in Papua New Guinea and across the world. So I just thought I'd include this because there's a very interesting part about David's experience in the early 1930s when he was a journalist and went down to the Melbourne docks, and he would meet the docks to meet the people who had come out from Europe. Often they were refugees, and they would want to talk to them to find out what was going on. And he wrote here, by this time we had our cable services, this is on the right-hand page, and our radio broadcast, of course, yet it still seemed that whatever was happening in Europe. The spiritual truth of events, could only be given reality by the fact of somebody talking about them. He had to be there, right there in front of us, sitting in the tasteful cabin that's on the cruiser that had come into Melbourne, describing the smoke pall above the Reichstag, or the mass banners tossing on the Tempelhof, or the endless torchlit tramplings of the brown shirt columns down the Brandenburger Tor. So it talks about this sudden awareness in Australia of what was happening in Nazi Germany and in Europe. So here's just a quick trailer from my brother Jack about experiences. I'll run this. So there you go. Another one is well known is Tom Hungerford's The Ridge and the River, which was a depiction of jungle fighting in the latter days of the war, in fact in the final weeks of the war before the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And it talks about this commando unit behind the lines and the harsh realities of fighting in this remote place away from any of the big battles, the difficulties of jungle life. And Tom Hungerford wrote this directly based on his service in Bougainville. And so a number of people have written the praises of how it was such a realistic book and how it really focuses in on the experiences. Basically, the story is that there's two men, an Australian patrol is struggling through the jungle, and they have two wounded men with them, and they have to get back to their home base, and they come to this river, which normally would not be difficult to pass through, but they now have two badly wounded men. They're all exhausted, and they're probably all suffering tropical diseases. So I've just included a page talking about the experiences of coming to this river and having to cross it, but not feeling ready to do so. So here it is, and you can read that in the PDF as well. So it talks about how they have to gear themselves up to cross this river. And so I won't talk about what happens next, but it's a very engaging story. I probably read it a while ago, but I remember it very well. On the home front, as we know, in 1942, the Americans arrived in Australia and brought a whole new way of life and experience. And these were very young men, often from the poor, farming states of the United States. And this was probably their first experience of city life for many of them. And so, they created quite a stir in Australia. And there was some jealousy between the men, the Australians and the Americans, because the Americans were very popular with some of the young women. Particularly, they were known to sort of be a lot more generous in giving flowers and chocolates and things like that. So I've heard. But also, they got paid a lot more. They got about double what an Australian private received in terms of wages. So anyway, they had a big influence on the local economy. Cafes began advertising Coca-Cola, coffee, hamburgers, hot dog stands, etc. And so it was quite a big deal. And so this is just another ad about a sort of a home away from home for American servicemen in a capital city, either Brisbane or Sydney, I presume. In Sydney, it was mainly naval personnel. It tended to be more army up in Brisbane. So the reason for me talking about that is just to mention Come In Spinner, which was a very well-known book written, I think, in 1947, written by two women, and it talks about the life in Sydney of these two women who work in a hotel, which I think is probably based on the Hotel Australia, and the experience of wartime in Sydney, nightclubs, pubs, visiting soldiers and sailors, and in some ways sort of shocked sort of middle-class Australia at the time. It doesn't shy away from subjects, adultery and issues to do with rape and spiking drinks and so on. But it's also about the families and the relationships and the experience of worrying about loved ones on the front. So it was a very well-known book. Another interesting sort of completely different is these sort of what were called the Christmas books, were these books that were inspired a bit by the Anzac Book from the First World War. And John Treloar, who was the director of the Australian War Memorial, sort of started them off. And they were illustrated books, sort of anthologies written by people on the front line, people in service overseas. and they were very popular. And the reason they were called the Christmas books is that they were released at Christmas. So you can see some of the figures there in terms of publishing, which was a big deal in Australia at that time. A big deal today as well in terms of the numbers sold. They're very popular. But also just bits about everyday life in the army, the boredom, coping, some of the funny characters. So they were a big sort of mixture. So the Navy had their own books. Here are some of them. That's an example of a copy that you can see there. A very striking sort of maritime painting on the right. And there's an article on the Royal Historical Society of Australia, Naval Historical Society of Australia, about these books that I read. And I thought I'd include the link, but it's not there. RAAF also got in on the act. The Army had jungle warfare. This is a photo of an anti-aircraft gunner that was included in one of the books. I've got one of these books I think I inherited from my father. So yeah, they were an interesting phenomenon, and they included a lot of short stories, as I mentioned, and poems. Some of the other books that were published after the war: The Long Green Shore by John Hepworth, We Were the Rats by Lawson Glossop, and is considered one of the finest books about the war, written about the siege of Tobruk and the defence by the Australians there. Some books were written many years after the war, such as John Cusack's They Hosed Them Out, a very graphic title and a brutal real account of life in the RAAF in World War II, so only published in 2011. Dead Men Rising was published in the 1950s. It was by a veteran, Seaforth Mackenzie, who was an Australian serviceman, and it's about a Japanese prisoner of war breakout. Richard Flanagan wrote this Booker Prize-winning book, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, based on his father's experiences about being a prisoner of war in a Japanese prison camp. One of Australia's best-known poets, Kenneth Slessor, wrote a poem about the war when he was an Australian war correspondent, which is well known, called Beach Burial. Just before we wrap up, another journalist who we can't forget is Alan Moorhead, who's writing as a war correspondent, is very well known, and well, particularly at the time, and there's a short video about his work now.
Alan Moorhead was renowned as a correspondent for his coverage of World War II campaigns in the Middle East and Asia, the Mediterranean and Europe, as well for his Nile series African Trilogy, his biography of Field Marshal Montgomery, and his history Gallipoli. The critic Clive James wrote of African Trilogy that it was perhaps the best example of Moorhead's characteristic virtue as a war correspondent. He could widen the local story to include its global implications. James, in fact, rated him a far better reporter on combat than his friend Ernest Hemingway.
When journalists become famous, it's usually because of something they disclose. Alan Moorhead became famous because of the way he wrote. He was the master of the graceful sentence. He made it look effortless, except it wasn't. Moorhead was the true Renaissance man, world traveller, naturalist, historian, but above all, we should remember him for his words. A young journalist could do much worse than try to write like Alan Moorhead.
Thanks for listening in, and I hope you found some books of interest.